And Keith, I have to ask you, I'm also I do HSN, and I bought your guitar.
There are moments in a public figure's life when the changes happening around them are so quiet, so gradual, that the outside world barely notices at first. A small shift here. A subtle adjustment there. But when those moments stack up fast enough, and when they happen against the backdrop of a very public unraveling, even the most casual observer starts paying attention. That is exactly where things stand with Keith Urban right now. Something is changing, and people want to know what it means. To understand the transformation, you have to go back much further than the recent headlines. You have to go all the way back to where Keith Urban started, because who someone becomes in a crisis is often a direct echo of who they were long before the world ever knew their name. Keith Urban was born in New Zealand in 1967, but Australia shaped him. His family settled in Brisbane when he was still very young, and the life they built there was anything but comfortable. His parents ran a small convenience store, and the family lived in a tight space directly behind it. There was no separation between work and home, no breathing room, no cushion against the hard edges of daily life. But even that modest picture softens the reality. The truth is that Keith grew up in conditions most people would struggle to describe without pause. He was raised, in large part, on a farm, in a shed, where 4 people shared one open space with no bedrooms and no privacy. At times, the family depended on the generosity of their community just to make it through the week. That kind of beginning does something to a person. It instills a hunger that is hard to explain to someone who has never gone without. It also leaves behind a wound that does not always show from the outside. For Keith, that wound had layers. His father struggled with alcoholism, and the atmosphere of the household reflected it. By Keith's own account, there was very little warmth or emotional connection inside those walls. Discipline was harsh. Affection was largely absent. He would carry the weight of that environment deep into adulthood, and it would take years before he fully understood what he had actually lived through. But music lived in that house too. His father loved country music deeply, and that love became the one language the two of them shared. It was through music that they found something like connection, and it was through music that Keith found something like hope. He received a ukulele at just 4 years old. His father played drums, so rhythm was simply part of the air Keith breathed from his earliest memories. Then, at 5 years old, his parents took him to see Johnny Cash perform live. For most children, a concert is just an evening out. For Keith Urban, it was a revelation. Standing there watching Cash command that stage, he did not see something distant or impossible. He saw himself. He saw exactly where he was meant to be. By the time he was 7, he had traded the ukulele for a guitar and was already performing wherever anyone would have him. Talent shows, local events, small neighborhood gatherings, he took every stage he could find. At 9, he appeared on an Australian television program, and even then, the road was not smooth. A judge dismissed country music as a lesser art form and offered stinging criticism of Keith's performance. It could have broken a child of that age. Instead, Keith held onto a single word the judge had used in backhanded praise and let it carry him forward. That capacity to find footing in the smallest sliver of encouragement would define him for the rest of his career. At 10, his family's home burned to the ground. He walked back through those blackened, soaked rooms and saw the totality of what had been lost. What stayed with him, though, was not just the devastation. It was the response of the community around him. Neighbors showed up with food, clothes, and open doors. People he barely knew offered everything they had. That experience carved something permanent into his understanding of what human beings are capable of for one another. By his mid-teens, music was no longer a hobby. It was an identity. At 15, he sat his mother down and laid out a plan to leave school and pursue music full-time. She agreed. It was a decision that altered the entire trajectory of his life. He threw himself into the Brisbane live music scene, playing long nights across bars and clubs, stretching himself across genres to give each crowd exactly what they wanted. He was building something, one show at a time. His debut album in Australia arrived in 1991 and found a genuine audience within the country music community. It opened doors, including the chance to tour with Slim Dusty, a towering figure in Australian music. A conversation with Slim during that tour became one of those experiences Keith would return to repeatedly over the years. When Keith mentioned there were only a few shows remaining, Suggesting relief at the end of the grind, Slim grew quiet. He spoke instead about having only a few more opportunities left to truly connect with an audience. That reframe changed something fundamental in the way Keith thought about performing. It was no longer routine. It was a privilege with a finite number of uses. In 1992, he made the move that every serious country artist eventually considers. He packed up and went to Nashville. The city welcomed him in spirit but not in opportunity. Breaking into that scene proved extraordinarily difficult. He formed a band, signed a deal, released an album, and watched it stall. The touring life that followed was grueling and demoralizing. Long stretches in a worn-out van, playing to sparse crowds, momentum collapsing under its own weight. When the band dissolved, it felt like failure. But beneath the professional setback, something far more serious was happening. The isolation and insecurity of starting over in a new country had opened a door that proved very hard to close. During a vulnerable stretch early in his Nashville years, Keith was introduced to cocaine. What began as a single moment of escape gradually consumed years of his life. He combined it with heavy drinking. He lived in a way that can only be described as barely surviving, cycling through nights that bled into mornings, staying up in desperate loops, filling any gap in his schedule with substance rather than stillness. By the late 90s, the spiral had become impossible to ignore, even for him. In 1998, he made the decision to check himself into rehab. It was not the end of his struggle, but it was the beginning of an honest reckoning. Something a counselor said during that period never left him. The idea was simple. No one walks a perfect path, but the goal is always to keep leaning toward the light. Keith carried that thought forward into everything he did afterward, including his music. His solo American debut in 1999 changed everything. Songs connected in a way his earlier work never had. A #1 hit followed. Platinum sales arrived within months. By 2001, he was standing on the stage of the CMA Awards receiving the Horizon Award for Newcomer of the Year, a moment that crystallized just how far the road had actually traveled. From a shed in Brisbane to the biggest stage in country music, the arc was remarkable and hard-earned. Then came Nicole Kidman. They met in 2005 at an event celebrating Australian talent in Los Angeles. She felt something immediately. He felt it too, but could not bring himself to act on it. He had her phone number for 4 months and never dialed it. Fear of rejection kept him frozen. When he finally found the courage to reach out, things moved quickly. He appeared outside her apartment on her birthday at 5 in the morning with gardenias. No elaborate gesture, no performance, just sincerity. For her, it was enough. They married in Sydney in June 2006 with close friends filling the room, including Hugh Jackman, Russell Crowe, and Naomi Watts. Keith would later say that everything before Nicole felt like prologue, that real life only began when she entered it. But the marriage did not get a gentle start. Just 4 months after the wedding, he relapsed and checked back into rehab. Nicole had intervened directly. He emerged from it and fought hard to rebuild what had almost broken before it fully formed. He acknowledged openly that his actions had nearly cost him the marriage before it had a real chance to take root. They built a family together. Their daughter Sunday Rose arrived in 2008. Faith Margaret followed in 2010. Fatherhood reshaped him in ways he had not anticipated. He had grown up without sisters, without softness, without much of what his daughters brought into his world. He embraced it fully. 4 years, the marriage looked like one of the rare ones that actually worked under the pressure of extreme public scrutiny and enormous professional demands. But pressure has a way of finding the cracks eventually. Long separations became routine. Tour schedules and filming commitments pulled them in different directions for months at a time. By 2024, observers began noticing that Keith was showing up to major events alone more frequently. His answers to questions about the marriage became more measured, more careful, as though he was choosing words with unusual precision. Then, in September 2025, the news arrived that the marriage had ended. Nearly 2 decades together, and it was over. According to those close to the situation, it had not been a sudden break but a slow unraveling, a growing distance that had gradually shifted from emotional to physical. Keith had reportedly established his own place in Nashville. The lives that had once run in close parallel had drifted onto separate tracks. What followed was a storm of speculation. Allegations of an affair circulated loudly online. A clip from one of his 2025 performances went viral because of what appeared to be a deliberate and pointed lyrical change during the show. Social media dissected every detail. Colleagues came forward to dispute the most inflammatory claims. Keith himself addressed the gossip directly from the stage of a Nashville arena, asking audiences not to read too much into things. Yet the changes kept coming. He had already parted ways with his longtime band earlier in 2025, a split that surprised many in the industry. The bassist and collaborator who had stood beside him since the 90s was gone. Other core members followed. Keith described it as following an inner voice, a pull toward something new. His divorce was finalized in January 2026, with a custody arrangement that gave Nicole the primary time with their daughters. So what is the transformation actually about? Is it a man remaking himself in the aftermath of loss? Is it something darker, a midlife unraveling disguised as reinvention? Or is it simply the latest chapter in a life that has never once followed a predictable line? The honest answer is that it is probably all of those things at once. Keith Urban has always been someone who processed his inner world through his music and his performances. The changes visible to the outside world right now are almost certainly a reflection of a deeper internal shift, one that he has not yet finished understanding himself. What history does tell us, though, is this: Keith Urban has been through the kind of circumstances that would have ended most people's stories long before they began. A hard childhood, addiction, failure, loss. And each time, he found a way to keep moving forward, not because the path was clear, but because stopping was never something he was willing to accept. Whatever is happening now, wherever this transformation is leading, the man at the center of it has proven, more than once, that his story is not one that ends quietly.